Okay. Thank you, Yafa, for this introduction, and also for giving the background for what I want to talk about, because what I really want to talk about comes out of the situation in Gaza, where Israel started after the disengagement, putting certain sanctions or economic sanctions or limitations on passing of different foods and medicine, etc. But I try to take it to the abstract and think a little about this question, not in the specific context of Gaza. So first of all, what are economic sanctions? What are we talking about? I think the best definition is Michael Reisman's definition, which says that economic sanctions may take many forms and may be applied unilaterally or multilaterally, but like all uses of economic instrument, they involve the purposive threat of actual granting or withholding of economic indulgences, opportunities, and benefits by one actor or group of actors in order to induce another actor or group of actors to change or adjust an internal or external policy. Which, the definition is a good one because it tells us what is exactly the difference between economic sanctions and military sanctions. There is no specific use of force. You do not use force. You use other means that are at your hand to force the enemy to do something other than what or the other party to do something other than what he's doing. Now there are three kinds, I think, perhaps more, but generally. We can speak about three kinds of economic sanctions. One is the UN sanctions, which are the most famous sanctions, those implemented by the Security Council. There are sanctions not connected to armed conflicts, and these are sanctions which happen between states, different states, at different times in history, where states implemented sanctions against one another. What I am interested in are economic sanctions which happen within an armed conflict. And within an armed conflict, the occurrence of economic sanctions is interesting because it is controlled, or the interaction between the parties is now controlled not by general human rights, or not only by human rights, but also by international humanitarian law. The question that I'm asking is whether do we have principles of international humanitarian law or of other laws which control the interactions of states when they are, or the parties, when they are at armed conflict, whether international or non-international, regarding this question of economic sanctions. Now, there are two or three preliminary points I want to address. The first is, and I speak about it at length in the paper, and I don't want to get into it too much now, is that I assume some background obligation. That is, I assume that there is in the background some obligation to provide, whether it is food or medicine or education. Now, this is not necessary. Of course, not in every conflict there is, and not regarding every indulgence, there is a duty of one party to provide the other party with the specific thing. Will it be food or education or medicine or what have you. So, but I assume, and the reason I assume it is because modern conflicts involve more and more parties which have some kind of prior obligation towards one another. Whether we are speaking about a civil war or an internal conflict where a state has some obligations towards its citizens, even though right now there is an armed conflict, like perhaps in Sri Lanka, or whether there is, like Yafa said, a history of occupation where there is some remaining obligations which might go with you to the future. I'm not dealing here with the question, where does the obligation come? There is, on the background, there is some kind of obligation to provide. And the question is really, what are the limits of this obligation? When can we derogate from this obligation? The Second point I'm assuming here is that when we're speaking within an armed conflict, there is a trade-off. And I think Professor Bradley talked about it a little earlier. And once again, I don't want to go into it in much greater detail, but there is some trade-off here between economic sanctions and military sanctions. Meaning, if you use economic sanctions, you'll use less military sanctions. Perhaps, sometimes, it is an alternative. Sometimes there is a trade-off. I mean, if you will completely say, you'll completely prohibit use of every economic sanctions, it means that the parties would use more military sanctions. Okay, so these are just two preliminary points. Now, I am saying that in modern conflicts, and I already started thinking about it, there are more reasons to regulate economic sanctions because, and there are several reasons. First, democratic states tend to try to avoid large military operations in certain settings because of the costs, because you need support of the entire polity, because of the effects of the media and international courts. There are many reasons why states try to avoid large-scale military operations. They have at their means, they realize, other ways of affecting what the enemy does. One of them is economic sanctions. And if states use it more, it means, I think, that we should think about it more and think whether we have something to say about it and regulate it. There are more, and modern wars have more actions of non-state actors from within civilian population. And once the other actor acts from within civilian population, this means that economic sanctions will become a more relevant option for the other party. Because the other party sees a military operation as problematic, because what are you going to do with a terrorist group that hides within a civilian population? But on the other hand, if you can say to the whole civilian population, listen, we're taking away your food, your medicine, your education, what have you, then this makes sense to the attacking party. Maybe this will affect the way that maybe they'll throw the terrorists out, maybe they'll do something that will help us. There is also growing economic interdependence. I mean, communities, states, but not only states, towns, villages, what have you, that used to be until 100, 150 years ago self-sufficient, are not self-sufficient anymore. So it's easy to implement economic sanctions. You can simply say, okay, no trucks of medicine are going to go through, or food, or bread, or anything else are going to go through, and then there'll be no bread in this specific area. So this is a game. And going back to the idea I said earlier about obligations, we have more and more conflicts where we have to think about the interaction between human rights, obligations, and prohibitions. And prohibitions perhaps coming from IHL, and I don't want to go into this any further because actually the prior session dealt about it. Now, I think what we have now, if we look at the positive law, the law as it is, we have a principle. We have several things about economic sanctions, but we have some principle. The principle, I call it the principle of severity. Okay? You cannot use very severe economic sanctions. For example, starvation, Additional Protocol 1, Article 15, of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited. You cannot starve the civilians of the other party. Or, Geneva Convention 4, Article 23, each high contracting party shall allow, mind, this is not provide, this is allow the free passage of all consignments of medical and hospital stores and objects necessary for religious worship intended only for civilians of another high contracting party, even if the latter is its adversary. Now, so very severe sanctions are prohibited. Note that even this sanction has limitations. I don't want to go into it, but it's a limited obligation. The obligation of the high contracting party to allow the free passage of consignment is subject to several conditions. And if it helps the enemy, or the enemy doesn't use it in a correct way, it doesn't go exactly to civilians, but goes to combatants, then you don't have to go, you don't have to pass. So there is a limitation in positive law, but it's only in extreme cases. I would even say the following. It seems to me, I have some proof for it, but not conclusive enough, that this developed in a piecemeal way. Meaning there was a specific instance where terrible things happened as a result of economic sanctions, and then this thing became prohibited because people realized this is very bad. But there's no principle behind it, or there's no principled thought about the question. There is one exception, this is that in blockades. The San Remo principles of the law of the sea, which their international status is not it's not completely clear what they are, but whatever they are, they seem to have a principle about what can you do with blockades are a kind of economic sanction in the sense that they are trying to affect the enemy without using military sanctions, and they are very, very popular in wars. Now, the declaration of establishment of the blockade is prohibited if it has the sole purpose of starving the civilian population. This is the principle of severity I talked to, but there is another thing. And this might be a little hidden behind the chairs, but this is the important part. The damage to the civilian population is or may be expected to be excessive in relation to concrete and direct military advantage anticipated from the blockade. So there is the principle of proportionality here, right, in using economic sanctions. It seems as though people who wrote this thought about the principle of proportionality as a guiding principle even for economic sanctions. I will say later why I'm not sure that this is the correct principle. What are the options? The options, I think there are generally, we have to choose between two options. First option is continue what we're doing right now. I would call it 5 minutes, a case by case. The second option is trying to find principles. Now, for reasons that are explained in my paper, I do not think that the principle of distinction and the principle of proportionality as they are right now in international humanitarian law are relevant to economic sanctions. In short, it's impossible to implement them as they are. We have to think of other principles, and I suggest two principles which might be relevant. The first one is what I call the principle of effectiveness. If you want to use an economic sanction against a party, you have to show that it has at least a reasonable chance to be an effective sanction. Meaning you are causing harm to the other party and to the civilians of the other party. And I'm putting in brackets here, we can discuss whether this is collective punishment. I don't think it's collective punishment. I don't think every economic sanction is collective punishment, but in the paper I explain why. But leave this question aside. You are causing harm. The least you have to prove is that there is some chance of this being an effective sanction. The effectiveness of a sanction is actually something that I learned from the principle of proportionality. No, the principle of proportionality assumes the following. A, you are causing harm to civilians. B, you have some military advantage. And C, the military or the harm to civilians is not greater than the harm to civilians. But the assumptions behind the principle of proportionality is that this will work, right? That the military action will succeed, or has a chance, or a reasonable chance to succeed, because otherwise there's no military gain and there's nothing to compare to. So I'm taking this idea, the idea of consequences, reasonable consequences, reasonable chances to succeed as a basic point. And the basic point is that if you want to implement sanctions, you have to show, or you have to at least believe, that there is a reasonable chance that it will succeed. This, I think, morally, as I explained, is a taking from proportionality, but I think even if you don't believe in morality in war, even if you think that wars are not moral, but the laws of war are created according to interests of state, I think there is also an interest here, and I explain in 2 sentences only, And for more, I'm sorry I'm doing this, but the paper, of course, includes more than I'm speaking about. The point of interest in this. One of the reasons that we have the international humanitarian law, the laws of armed conflict, is that in-state actors want to control irrational in-state actors within their own state. You want to make war a rational phenomenon, not only for the enemy, but also for your own people. You want your own state not to take irrational steps. Economic sanctions are a great place for irrational people to place their bets on. Right? This is the holy grail, right? Why don't you just cut off all their electricity, cut off all the water, cut off all the medicine, and they'll do what you want. Well, we see this a lot in discussions about Gaza in popular press in Israel, right? Just, you know, you don't have to go into it. There's no need for military sanctions. Just do. Some of it is irrational. Some of it makes no sense. It makes sense only if you think that revenge is a legitimate goal in war, and this is revenge. So I think also in order to control in-state actors. So this is, and the second principle, and this will be my last word, and I'm not speaking about this, and again in the paper I have a lot about how to assess the effectiveness. Of course you have to assess which are your targeted state. Of course against North Korea, economic sanctions won't work as they work against, I don't know, Israel or democratic parties, but so it depends who is your target state. But there's another principle, and I call it the principle of conditionality. If you want to use economic sanctions, you must put them not in a general way saying, these economic sanctions are in place until the war is finished, or until you acquiesce, or until you bring out the white flag. I think I heard once that President Bush said about but perhaps not President Bush, perhaps one of his advisors said, that okay, we'll give the people in Guantanamo the status of prisoners of war until the end of the conflict, the end of the war on terror, right? So we'll hold them until the end of the war. No, but you have to put in conditions, specific conditions, time frames, limitations. What are you going to achieve by these specific economic sanctions you want to use? I'll wrap up. Just a second. So what I'm thinking about is a state confronts another party, irregulars, another terrorist. It wants to use, it seems that there will be an effective use of economic sanctions, not only military sanctions. When is it allowed to do it? It is allowed to do it only if it can show A, that it's not very severe, B, that it has a reasonable chance of success, and C, that there are specific conditions, and Israel sanctions in Gaza. I'll just state this. The court, when it reviewed Israel sanctions in Gaza, it applied only the first principle, the principle of severity. It said in the decision of al-Basyuni versus the Prime Minister, what you have to provide is essential humanitarian needs. Meaning, do not do economic sanctions which are very severe. As long as you have some minimum humanitarian level which you give the Palestinians, it's okay. You can apply these sanctions. What I suggested the court should have considered, and perhaps it will consider in the future, because part of effectiveness is looking back and seeing what history tells us. It has also to look at effectiveness and also to look on conditionality of the economic sanctions applied by Israel towards Gaza. And that's it.
Before, I think it's really very important what you have analyzed this. for the special situation in Israel, but for me, to a certain way, it's like writing a chapter in international law, because while you were talking, I was just thinking about the fact that we have Article 41 and 42 to the UN Charter, while Article 42 and 51 allows the use of force, and then there's a whole bunch of law about what is legitimate in the use of force and the limits of the use of force. Article 51 gives the general power to the United Nations to give economic sanctions, but we don't have an organized body of law that really limits the ability of states to do it. So to a certain way, I think you've done a very, very important, broad international law work, and thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. As I said before, while we're trying to create and develop the law against terror, we had the constitutional due process aspect, we had the international law aspect on a very really special and needed topic, and now we are getting with Dr. Gabi Alevi from also this institution, from the Ono Academic College. He will be talking about counterterrorism law and inchoate offenses. I want to cite one sentence from your lecture with your permission. You say the fight against terrorism affects the definition of inchoate offenses, and inchoate offenses are used as a major instrument of criminal law in the fight against terrorism, which fits the general idea about this panel, which comes and says, well, that we don't have in advance something, so we take now a body of a body of criminal law that was really dormant to a certain way, and we now revive it through the idea of combating terrorism. We use it to combat terrorism, and then on the other way, while combating terrorism with this with these offenses, we really develop a part of criminal law, and this fits the whole scheme of this important panel, please.